Last week we began exploring the history of worship. I want to continue with that today, and we'll conclude it next week, so to speak, with obviously with bluegrass music, a different style of worship, but still worship. Worship God, and the Bible tells us to worship God with all kinds of instruments, with singing and song praising and chanting and all this kind of stuff. We want to continue this today. Worship, again, last week I gave you definitions as to show or feel reverence and honor for someone or something sacred. And there's many different things, people in the world worship. And gosh, I was watching something recently about the Ganges River in India. And the Hindus go where they worship the river, and they immerse themselves in it, and they burn the dead out, they float them out in there and burn them, and I'm looking at that river, and the elephants were coming down in it, and these people were all down there in it, hundreds of thousands, well, thousands anyway. I say, I don't know if I want to be in that river or not. Thank God I don't have to immerse myself in a river that's been, I'm not supposed to say it's polluted, I don't know. But we don't have to worship that way. From our perspective, from a biblical perspective, we are to worship God, Yahweh, Jehovah, Christ, the Spirit. That's who we are to worship. And only that. Not even angels. There's the angelology and all that. Out there, some people worship angels. Some people revere angels. It doesn't matter to have a little angel. And we pray for about guardian angels to be with us. But you see instances in the Bible, the true angels did not accept worship. They would say, do not worship me. Of course, fallen angels want that worship. That's the reason they're fallen. Satan was the great fallen angel kicked out of heaven because he wanted to be worshipped like God. False gods, idols, material things. I think in our culture and time, we are tempted, and if I worship anything of that nature, worship is not really the correct word, but material things, we might fall into that tendency. Hopefully we don't, but we could. In the Old Testament, we talked about it a little bit last week, there seemed to be a very strong desire to worship. Again, they saw God do a lot of miracles, saw God do a lot of things, and so I can sort of understand that. We don't see that often. We might hear testimony or stories about it and what have you, but they saw God do a lot of things. In some ways, we need that strong feeling. I'm talking to myself here, I need that strong feeling to worship God. I'm lacking it at times. I let things in life and situations and what have you distract me from worshiping God. As you read on in the Old Testament, and Israel progressed as a kingdom. You know how the kings and all that stuff, you saw where the worship became more structured. An order of worship, so to speak, that we still follow to this day, similar we follow to this day. And then, and it became ritualistic. There were rituals, stuff that were repeated. So that sort of happened again in the kingdom period, the time of the kings in Israel's history. And we jumped ahead about 1,500 years roughly to the time of Emperor Constantine and the worship style that we have today. This that started again about 300, 350 AD, that processional, the pomp and circumstance that they really copied from the palace, from the emperor's palace. That sort of, the church adopted those holy processions and procedure, the liturgy. You know, and that was the style of worship that what we call today traditional style of worship really followed through to most of our childhoods. Maybe into the, you know, if you're my age group, into the 60s, 70s and 80s. That was pretty much, you went to any church, maybe other than maybe a Pentecostal holiness, kind of more free will, jump in the pew and all that kind of stuff that some of us might have been raised in. I think about Gene going with this story. It's a style of worship. Nothing wrong. I'm going to say there's nothing wrong with any of it. It's just, but that was more rare when we were growing up. The traditional style that we see now was more the way it was done. But then you started hearing in the 60s and 70s, especially with the charismatic movement, they started adopting some of the things that Pentecostal denominations have been doing for a long time. And said, we want to go back to the way the New Testament church did it. We want to go back to the way the early church did it. You hear that term a lot. Let's see how they did it in the early church. And of course, people started investigating that. Then you started to see what we call contemporary style of worship. You know, where it's a little bit freer, so to speak. I like the freedom of the contemporary worship. In a more traditional processional style of worship, let me say this while I come to my mind. I like what we did last Sunday. That was good. I had a lot of positive comments about that. So we're going to do that more often. We call ourselves a blended worship, blended with traditional and contemporary, and we're going to start doing a little bit more a little bit more traditional type of worship. Can I get some amens on that? Y'all like that? It's maybe a little more participatory. Is that right? Participatory.
Yeah.
Chosen that.
You know, both have their pros and cons, as everything does. The traditional style gets to be, and I think the word is rote or repetitive, and essentially you start going through the motions. Now that can happen with contemporary praise and worship. You know, I'm not, but when the contemporary worship style became in the vogue, is all my words correct? Can you help me, y'all, other teachers? In vogue, or whatever the word is, it became popular. This is the way to do it. This is the way to do it. And church growth people would tell you that, and I think it's true. I would agree with it. If I could only have one or the other, I would pick contemporary. I'm just being honest with you. If I had to choose between the two, that's what I like when we blend it together. And she does an excellent job, of course, doing that. And again, we're going to throw in a little bit more traditional as time goes on. I think it's a good mix. It's a good mix. But church growth people will tell you to attract a younger crowd, they're more attracted to the contemporary. Guitars and drums. To some churches, I'm so proud when I get to brag about this church, this congregation, that I can brag, I can say, man, we got drums. We've got 2 guitars. And my drummer's a 17-year-old, just graduated from high school. Do you know how foreign that is to a church this size in a rural setting? in some people's mind, that's sin. And that's stupid. It's not. You know? It's not. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with standing up and opening up your book like you did growing up and doing this. There's nothing wrong with it. God told me, he said, I said, well, yeah, we got a screen up. He said, man, I wish I could have done that. I had to put a TV up. You thought he put a big screen TV up. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with sitting there and reading out of that. There's nothing wrong with sitting there and reading the words there, is it? People get all worked up about that kind of stuff, I think. But how did the early church worship? How did they do it? It's interesting. A lot of similarities, even in this church. Met in homes on Sunday. I don't know if that would have meant y'all came to our house, or we all only on Sunday, or we rotated around. I don't know how that worked. But they met in homes. Because the Jews had run them out of the synagogues. So the Christians had to find a place, and then he started having Gentiles embrace Christianity. They met in homes. They'd have some scripture reading. Prayer. Chanting or singing. They probably started out more of a chant than a melodious song that we would sing today. He was talking this morning about the melody or the tune or whatever, but it might have been a chant. Have you ever heard the chants, the old Gregorian chants? And it's actually, I like that. When we were in Europe and going to some of those cathedrals, you hear the chanting in the background and all that kind of stuff. It's actually, but they chant, sing, and it was primarily songs. Because that was what was put to music during Israel's time. You didn't have Charles Wesley's hymns and the other great hymns of the church in 300 and 400 AD. You didn't have a sermon, an offering, communion. Communion was normally done every week. And they said that the first church buildings were not till about 330, 350 AD. Constantine said, all right, Christianity is the official religion of the state. Go out and build me some churches. And that's until around that time period, 300 to 350, the early church, Christian movement, and all over the Roman Empire were meeting in homes. Constantine put out the money and started building churches. Yeah, sounds like what we're doing right now. In a lot of ways. In a lot of ways. All right, we've looked at sort of how it was in the Old Testament. We looked at the early church. What did Jesus say about worship? What did Jesus say about worship? Well, there's an instance that I'm going to read you here in a second where Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. He's traveling through the area of Samaria, which most of the Jews avoided. He's at this well, and y'all read that, heard that story, and what have you. There's a lot of give and take between him and her. But, and first thing she was, you're a Jew, and you're talking to me. Jews normally did not have anything to do with the Samaritans. They didn't share their faith. She was struck, why are you talking to me? And they go through her lifestyle and what have you. And Jesus said, they talk about the water, bringing the water out and all this stuff. And she, how are you going to draw the water out? They go, again, back and forth, but a give and take. And Jesus essentially says, I am living water. You drink from the water that I have, and you will never be thirsty. you to be a prophet. And then we pick this up right after she says that in verse 20, chapter 4, John 4, verses 20 through 24. The Samaritan woman starts out saying, our fathers worship in this mountain. And you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. So they're going back for it. We worship here, and you Jews say you're supposed to worship in Jerusalem at the temple. So that's the setup here. And Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither is this mountain nor in Jerusalem shall you worship the Father. You worship that which you do not know. We worship that which we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and then he says, and is now. The time has come, it's now. Essentially is what he's saying. When true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be His worshipers. Verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. Going back through that, even though we worship in different places, talking about that, soon it won't matter where you worship. That's what Jesus said. It won't matter where you worship. He tells us that you worship what you don't know. We worship the one who brings salvation. Of course, he's talking about himself. Now is a time for true worship. A time to worship God in spirit and in truth. We want people to worship Him in this way because He is spirit. God wants people to worship Him in this way because He's spirit. He wants people to worship Him in spirit and in truth. Now what does this mean? It doesn't jump out at me. What does he mean by this? Worship God in spirit and truth. It sounds real good. Oh, worship God in spirit and truth. We preach it all day long. What does it mean? How are we to worship God in spirit and in truth? Now this is Blaine's take. This is what Blaine thinks it means. I think it's halfway correct. I think it's correct, but you may have a little bit different slant to. Let me know. Let me know. Truth. Let's start with truth. To me, it's saying, just don't go through the motions. Or repeat rituals that have no meaning to you. Just don't, okay, it's time to stand up, time to sit down, time to do this, time to do that. What became, I heard people, in the contemporary movement, interdenominational churches, the charismatic churches, you go in there. I remember the first time I ever went to one, and man, there's people, praising, raising your hand, and all this kind of stuff. And what happens is, if you ain't raising your hands, you ain't into it. Something must be wrong with you. You ain't got the Spirit. That's what the people would be. I don't think they wouldn't say it, but that's probably what they were thinking. You must not have the Spirit. You're not really into it. Yeah, you got to be up there, dance and jump in the pew. Now, did you feel a little pressure on that you should be doing that?
There's a little pressure that you have to pick my chair up and run to the church.
I mean, think about that. I think what God wants us to do is, like I said, is just don't go through the motion. I remember, bless his heart sound, and Jesus saying this, I remember saying this, and I forgot what denomination he'd throw off on, but he would say, he'd say, them folks just clap their hands raw, but they sure won't raise their hands. I think he might be talking about the Baptist or something. He said something. He said, yes. I know it's a particular church. He said, yeah, they get in that worship. They'll be clapping when you're, yeah, praise and sing, yeah. You know, and there's nothing wrong with that too. I don't have any rhythm, so I can't do it. You know, I'm not, you know, I don't know how to do it, but, and then how do you raise your hand and clap at the same time? Do you choose one or the other? Or do you raise one hand? And, you know, I've seen it all kind of different ways. But God wants you to worship Him in any of those ways, but He wants you to be truthful, realistic about it. Just don't do it because that's what everybody else is doing. You can sit down. You can stand up. You know. I underline, made myself a note, I underlined it this morning. Get into it. Get into worship. Enter into worship. You used to hear that term so many times. Enter into worship. Enter in, and that makes sense. It's theological, biblical. Enter into worship. Get into it. Worship because you want to. Because of God, who God is, and who He is to you. It's a personal thing. It's not to show other people what you do. Look at me. That person really got spirit. Woo, man. I bet, you know, spirit. What do you mean by spirit? Well, God is spirit. John tells us that. We know that. He gave us a human spirit. A spirit where we can connect with Him. I've said this numerous times, but God gave us a spirit. He's spirit. He gave us the human spirit so we can connect with Him. He gave us the Holy Spirit to go even further to help us live a Christian life. Part of which is to worship God. Worship God wherever you are. I've heard it frequently. I've said it to others. You can worship God at the tree stand, at the deer room, riding down the road, in your car, going to work, in the boat, fishing on the golf course, wherever you are. In the privacy of your own home, here in this church field, wherever you are, you can worship God. You can worship in a traditional style. You can worship in a contemporary style. You can, you know, I guess if you have a traditional worship, you don't can worship in contemporary style, you still clap. I remember growing up, nobody ever clapped after somebody sang a beautiful solo. Or the choir sang a beautiful song. You just didn't do it in the 60s in the Methodist Church. Now, is that not too far-fetched, is it? Or the Episcopal Church, maybe, or some more formal. You know, I just remember thinking, man, that was beautiful solo. And as a kid, you wanted to clap. That's what you normally did. You know, contemporary, traditional. It doesn't matter. Do it because you want to. Make that spirit connection. Folks, I wish I could say it happens all the time. And it's going to happen. This happens in singing most of the time. I mean, this whole thing that we do is a worship service. Hopefully announcements are, but it's hard to make announcements worshipful. But the whole thing is I'm not much on music, but I hear Tina hit a certain song, she'll hit a certain note. And then, Kelsey, I kid with her, and I said, now give me some tom-tom on that. That's about the only thing I know. And then she really, I start getting into that. I start entering into worship. And then the words, to Him is just on the throne, we did that last week. That just speaks to me. It just touches me. It makes me want to worship God. And I think, God. You are my King. You are my Master, my everything. That's why I sing to you. That's why I